Please come to order. I'm very pleased to welcome you to our inaugural Crown Forum honoring Dr. Peter Ackerman. You may use your phones for the QR code and read his biography on your own or after the Crown Forum. I'm going to give the occasion statement. Our speaker will be introduced. He will speak. He will take some questions, some answers he'll give. And at 5:30 this afternoon, he will return for our Thurman Thursday meeting during the Chapel Assistance Hour. And that will be in the African American Hall of Fame above the lobby. If you come, first come, first serve, you will get a copy of his 600-page definitive biography on Martin King. Hold up your books so they can see the cover. Okay? If you come at 5:30, first come, first serve, you will get one until they're gone. And we will continue to dialogue with him. Now listen very carefully. This will be abbreviated to tell you why we are inaugurating this Crown Forum for democracy, freedom, and nonviolent peace. Democracy is a government in which the supreme power is vested in the people and exercised by them directly or indirectly through a system of representation, usually involving periodically holding free elections. 10 years ago, the United States Supreme Court gutted, eviscerated the Voting Rights Act. In states with a history of racial voting discrimination, since then, white dominated state legislatures have passed nearly 100 restrictive laws to block the black vote in America. It becomes a matter of experience and empirical investigation to determine in specific circumstance whether, in what sense, and to what degree a person or society is free. If you cannot vote, you are not free. We must also understand that freedom is more important than virtue. Freedom is more important than virtue. If you are not free, you cannot practice virtue. If you are not free, you have no consent or veto power. You are a slave like Sally Hemings, was a slave to Thomas Jefferson. She had no consent when Thomas Jefferson raped her. Freedom consists in more than one thing alone. Many people think that freedom means simply not being constrained or being able to choose between live options or participating in a democratic political process. There are many connections between the personal dimensions of freedom and the social dimensions of freedom. There are many connections between the personal dimensions of freedom, such as external liberty, the ability to act on the basis of one's intentions, choice between live options, creativity, and the social dimensions of freedom, such as opportunity, social pluralism, integral lifestyle, and participatory politics. The last 100 years have been the most violent in the history of the world. And the worst of it has occurred in my lifetime. There is very little conversation today about the philosophy of nonviolence. But every evening, we are bombarded with reports on the evening news of the increasing number of violent deaths all over the world. Nonviolent peace is not a distant goal we seek. I will repeat that. Nonviolent peace is not a distant goal we seek, but a means by which we arrive at that goal. In 2002, Peter Ackerman became the founding chair of the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict. The stated purpose of the center was to develop and share knowledge related to nonviolent civil resistance and its practice with interested recipients throughout the world. This included citizens and activists, educators, non-governmental organizations, media professionals, and members of the policy community living under conditions of repression, injustice, and corruption. My dear brothers, we are living under such conditions today in the United States. Everybody of color. Therefore, this morning, we are institutionalizing at Morehouse the Peter Ackerman Crown Forum for Democracy, Freedom, and Nonviolent Peace to thematize the third Reconstruction. We want to guarantee that you will enjoy as much or more of the freedom that your parents enjoyed in the United States. but we have to first get your attention. Therefore, we've invited Mr. Jonathan Eig to address you this morning. He has written the definitive biography on Martin Luther King Jr. 600 pages. Guy, okay. This screen shows you the publications that have come out of the Nonviolent Center in DC, founded by Peter Ackerman. Read the titles, read the subtitles. This is going to guide us as we try to address the repressive laws that have been passed to give white supremacists a political advantage over you and to make your vote not count. I'm now going to invite the Reverend Mr. Devin Jerome Crawford to come forth and introduce our speaker. Reverend Crawford is our new campus minister, successor to the Reverend Quincy James Reinhardt. Reverend Crawford is a Morehouse College alumnus, former president of the Martin Luther King Jr. International Chapel Assistants, graduate of the University of Chicago, and he comes to Atlanta from Harvard, where he was an officer at the William Monroe Trotter Institute at Harvard University. Senator Raphael Warnock brought him to Atlanta to work at Ebenezer on black male incarceration. And so you're going to be hearing from him at least 2 times during the school year, address you. And the first time will be in November when we bring Professor Ron Sullivan from the Harvard Law School. Reverend Crawford.
Thank you, Dean Carter. Good morning, Morehouse. It is my pleasure to introduce our Crown Forum speaker for the morning, Mr. Jonathan Eig. Jonathan Eig is the author of King, A Life, the first major biography in over a decade of one of the most prominent leaders of the modern civil rights movement and a Morehouse man, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., class of 1948. In this revelatory new portrait of the preacher, scholar, and activist leading a historic nonviolent revolution of values, Mr. Eig gives us a humanized perspective of Dr. King, an MLK for our times. Eig portrays Dr. King as a deep thinker, a brilliant strategist, and a committed radical who led one of our history's most greatest movements, and whose demands for racial and economic justice remain urgent today as they were in his lifetime. Hailed as a master storyteller by documentary filmmaker Ken Burns, Jonathan Eig is the New York Times bestselling author of 6 books, including Ali, A Life, Luckiest Man, The Life and Death of Lou Gehrig, and Opening Day, the story of Jackie Robinson's first season. Mr. Eig's books have been listed among the best of the year by The Washington Post, The Chicago Tribune, Sports Illustrated, and Slate. Jonathan began his career at 16 years old, working for his hometown newspaper, the Rockland County Times. He went on to work as a reporter for the New Orleans Times, the Dallas Morning News, Chicago Magazine, and the Wall Street Journal, after earning a degree in journalism from the Northwestern University. He lives in Chicago with his wife and children, and in his words, shares office space with the laundry machines. Morehouse, won't you welcome our Crown Forum speaker for the morning, Mr. Jonathan Eig.
Good morning. I was asked to use this microphone. Is it working? Can you hear me now? No? Oh, there we go. I was asked to use this microphone. One of the things that happens when you spend 6 years researching another person's life is that you learn many of their tics and their habits. And Dr. King would often begin an address by saying, "I need not say how honored I am to be here today. But I do need to say how honored I am to be here in this historic and sacred space. This place filled with the dignity of Dr. King and Benjamin Mays, Howard Thurman, and so many others. And it's a great honor to be here with Dean Carter and Dr. Crawford and all of you students of Morehouse College, and to be a part of the new Peter Ackerman Forum on Democracy and Peace. Truly, thank you for having me. I begin my book by saying that on December 5th, 1955, a young black man became a founding father of the United States of America. Martin Luther King Jr. was 26 years old that day. And he knew that what he was doing put him at risk, that he faced a potential death penalty. The place was Montgomery, Alabama. Alabama, at that time, had seen 360 lynchings since Reconstruction. It was the former home of the capital of the Confederacy. And King stepped up because 2 days earlier, Rosa Parks had been arrested for refusing to give up her seat on the bus, as most of us know. I'm getting a little interference here. And the people of Montgomery had to decide that day what they were going to do. We take it as inevitable that the bus boycott would occur after Rosa Parks' arrest, but it was not inevitable. There had been attempts at bus boycotts in Montgomery before, and they had not gone anywhere. At that moment, the people had to decide what they were going to do on Monday. Were they going to stay off the buses? Were they going to be able to stay off the buses in sufficient numbers to make an impact? Because the buses of Montgomery had become, for generations, a moving theater of degradation for the black people of Montgomery. And it was a feeling that they were finally ready to do something about it. But they needed somebody to speak to the crowds, somebody to speak to the community, and to rally them. Because if 75% of the people stayed off the buses, if 80% of the people stayed off the buses, it would not necessarily succeed. And that day, they asked Martin Luther King Jr. to speak to the audience at Holt Street Baptist Church, the biggest church in town. And the reason they chose King is not because he was Martin Luther King Jr., the legendary civil rights leader. Quite the opposite. It was because he was unknown at that point. The community was looking for somebody who could lead, who was not controversial. And Martin King had not been in town long enough to make enemies. And he had a reputation, for being a pretty good speaker. So when King was invited to give this address, what he called the most important address of his life, he hurried home. He had 20 minutes to prepare. He said to Coretta, "I don't know what I just agreed to do." He was not looking for a position of leadership. In fact, just months earlier, he had said no when the NAACP had asked him to serve on the Alabama board of the NAACP. He was too busy. He had a new baby at home. He had a new congregation in Montgomery that he was still getting used to. He was still working on his doctoral dissertation. But here, he could not say no. He rushed home and said to Coretta, "I don't know what I've just agreed to, but I've got 20 minutes to give the biggest speech of my life." He went back into his study, and for the first 10 minutes, he had a panic attack. That's how he described it. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. When he finally cleared his head and caught his breath, he jotted some notes. Ralph Abernathy was waiting for him outside, honking the horn. They hopped in the car. They drove to Holt Street Church, and they couldn't get there because thousands of people were crowding the streets around the church. And that's when King realized that this was bigger than he thought. He stepped to the podium in that church and found his voice, found the voice that would define the rest of his career for the next 13 years. And I believe that he found the voice that would help not just Black America, but all of America see a greater vision for the future. He stood there that day at the podium and said, "It may be that it's the people of color who will help America deliver on its unfulfilled promise. It may be the people of color in this country who show America the way to truly live up to the promises that it made but did not deliver on. He said that day that if we are wrong in demanding justice here, then the Constitution is wrong. If we are wrong, the Bible is wrong. If we are wrong, the Supreme Court of this nation is wrong. And it was that message, that combination of spirituality, of theology, and the Constitution that I think really made King the centerpiece. It sent a message that was almost impossible for white Americans to ignore. And because King spoke not just from the Constitution, but also from the Bible, it was a message that resonated strongly with the churchgoers in that crowd. And what happened in the days ahead, we all know. People not only stayed off the buses, they stayed off it for a year. And as Howard Thurman said, when the people in power are confronted by people who demand change, their hold on that power begins to become suspect. And that was the great genius of Martin Luther King. By embracing nonviolence, by seizing the upper hand, he helped the people of Montgomery overcome their fear, the fear that had been used to hold them in place, and helped them to begin to march with confidence. And I want to just tell you one story about one person in Montgomery. I was going through the archives at Tulane University. I found the papers by Fisk University sociologists who were documenting the Montgomery bus boycott as it was happening. They were interviewing the people who were walking to work every day. They interviewed the bus drivers. They interviewed members of the Klan. They documented the entire Montgomery bus boycott. But the one person who they talked to who really sticks out with me was a woman named Dealey Cooksey. She was a maid working for a white family in a wealthy part of Montgomery. And she told these Fisk University sociologists that her boss had told her not to listen to Dr. King, that this young preacher, who wasn't even from Montgomery, was trying to lead them down a dangerous path. And Dealey Cooksey said to her employer, "Don't you talk about Dr. King. That young man is God sent." And she said, "We ain't rabbits no more." That was her phrase. The fear had gone out of the people of Montgomery. And Dr. King had found a message that would resonate, not just with those people, but with the entire country. I began this book on Dr. King because I realized that there were still hundreds of people in this country alive who knew him personally. And I wanted to begin interviewing them as quickly as I could, to write a new biography of King that would embrace those primary sources, the people who knew him well. I also came to the conclusion that in my lifetime, we've seen Dr. King's image watered down. We've seen him reduced to, "I have a dream." And we've lost sight even of what he said in the first half of his I Have a Dream speech. And we should require students not just to learn I Have a Dream, but to read the first half of the speech, where he talks about reparations, where he talks about police brutality, where he talks about incarceration, where he talks about the fact that the American government made a promise and wrote a check that came back with insufficient funds. Dr. King was a radical, and in embracing him, this country, and turning him into a national monument, and turning him into a national holiday, we have taken the radical side out of his message, and that is a message that we need to hear again. Thank you. Finally, I wrote this book because I wanted to write a book that restored some of Dr. King's humanity. In turning him into a monument, we've lost sight of the fact that he was a person, that he had flaws, that he had feelings, that he had doubts, that he suffered from depression, that he twice attempted suicide as a young man, that he, like the rest of us, was imperfect. Because if we expect our heroes to be perfect, we can't expect anyone to be a hero. So I began this quest, this 6-year journey of researching King's life, and I found some important new things about Dr. King that I want to share with you a little bit today in our time together. One thing I found was an autobiography, unpublished, by Martin Luther King Sr. And The Morehouse Library didn't know this existed. It was written with the cooperation, with help from a Morehouse professor, Dr. Edward Jones, but it had been lost to history. And Martin Luther King Sr. is such an important figure, really one of the great heroes of American history, because he's born in Stockbridge, Georgia, 20 miles south of here, as a sharecropper. His father and mother were farming cotton, and Martin Luther King Sr., at age 12, decides he's not going to take this anymore. He's seen what the punishment of segregation and sharecropping has done to his family, and he literally ties his only pair of shoes over his shoulder, walks out of Stockbridge, and makes his way to Atlanta, where he begins working on a railroad, then begins working as a circuit preacher, and then really talks his way into Morehouse College, fails the entrance exam, pleads with the president. He is climbing the ladder to American success. He is building his path to the American dream. And while he may not be perfect, he's building the path forward for his children and for his grandchildren. And one of the ways in which Dr. King is not perfect, Martin Luther King Sr. is not perfect, excuse me, I'll get the hang of this. I'll start calling him Daddy King, which is what everyone else called him. One of the ways that Daddy King was not perfect was that, and he talks about this in his unpublished autobiography, is that he had a temper. He was not perfectly nonviolent, and he sometimes spanked his children. And Martin Luther King Jr., interestingly, reacted differently to the spankings, to the whippings, than his siblings. He refused to show any reaction. He was stoic. And I think this is the earliest example we have of his understanding of the power of nonviolence. When you confront your oppressor, and Howard Thurman has written about this as well, when you confront your oppressor with your dignity, you take away your oppressor's power. And I think King sensed that at a very early age, and it was something that would prove incredibly valuable to him throughout the rest of his life. So, one of the other important discoveries I made in my research was some of the tapes that Dr. King's wife, Coretta Scott King, made soon after her husband's assassination. And I want to talk about Coretta for a minute, because she is one of the other really important forces. We'll talk later, if time permits, and this evening, about the importance of people like Dr. Thurman, like Benjamin E. Mays, like Gandhi on King's thought. But another important influence on King's thought and development was Coretta Scott King. And Coretta recorded this series of tapes right after her husband's assassination, and I believe I was the first researcher to listen to those tapes. And she talks about the fact that when she met King in Boston, he was at Boston University, she was at the New England Conservatory, Dr. King had no experience as an activist at that point. She had been to Antioch College, however, and had been very active on campus in protest movements. And she talks about the fact that it was her activism that really attracted Dr. King to her. She was the one recommending books for her to read, and she would become a hugely important source of inspiration. She was the one telling him that when Dr. King won the Nobel Peace Prize, we have a greater responsibility now than ever to go beyond fighting segregation, to go beyond racism, to think about things like poverty and hunger and world peace. And yet, one of the things that you hear often, repeatedly on these tapes that Coretta recorded, was the fact that she was not treated equally as a civil rights activist, that she was not given the opportunity to lead, and that over and over again in her marriage she had to make compromises. She had to stay home and take care of the children when she wanted to be out doing more. And this too, she says over and over, and this too I accepted. And her sacrifices have often been overlooked, and the full story of her courage has often been overlooked in telling Dr. King's story. After the Montgomery bus boycotts, King was still just 27 years old, and he wrote to one of his professors, "What do I do now? They're going to be expecting me to pull miracles out of my hat forever." He was a young man full of doubt, full of uncertainty, with the pressure of the world on his shoulders. And it's important to remember that his next few attempts after Montgomery did not succeed. He went to St. Augustine, he went to Albany, Georgia, and his movements there did not take off. But one of the great things about King is that he was a lifelong learner, and he studied from his mistakes, and he found solutions, and he was exposed to people who wanted to help him, and he embraced the advice of people like Ella Baker and Bayard Rustin, who came to Montgomery. It's interesting to think about, even when we talk, as we should be talking about nonviolence here today, when King began the Montgomery bus boycotts and Bayard Rustin came down and said, you can use the principles of Gandhi here. King had read Gandhi at Morehouse, but he still had a gun under the pillow of his sofa. And it was Bayard Rustin who said, if you're going to embrace this, you have to embrace it in a deeper, more personal way. You have to make this more than just a talking point on the podium. You have to make this a part of your life. And King did that. It became a philosophy, but it was over time. And it's only by the time he gets to Birmingham, I would argue, that he is fully using the powers of nonviolence, fully using the lessons that have come to him from all of these great advisors. And, King traveled to India, learned there. Another important discovery in my research papers was the L.D. Reddick, who was the archivist for the SCLC. All of his papers were at the Schomburg Library. He traveled with Martin and Coretta to India, saw the way King was learning along the way. But the nation really sees this and feels its impact for the first time, I would argue, in Birmingham, feels it at the greatest peak of its powers. That's the moment when the nation sees the true cruelty, sees what Dr. King has been doing all along, weakening the power of those who are taking advantage of the disinherited and the unempowered. And it's at that moment that John F. Kennedy finally reacts. It's at that moment that Northerners begin to say, something must be done. And it's at that moment that King starts to assemble people at the March on Washington and to bring this into people's living rooms. I think that may be the closest that King comes to realizing his dream. It may be the closest this country comes to truly turning a corner. And when King gives his most famous speech at the March on Washington and says, I have a dream, and millions of people all over America, black and white, are watching on television as literally black and white people are holding hands and singing in harmony, we see an opportunity. But what happens the next day? The next day, the FBI writes a memo that says, based on King's performance yesterday at the March on Washington, we must now consider him the most dangerous American. Let's pause and think about that for a minute. I'm not going to ask you to put yourself in the head of the warped mind of J. Edgar Hoover, but what made King a threat to the FBI? What made King such a threat that the FBI would ask the White House, ask the Attorney General to authorize wiretaps on King's home and office and on the home and office of his closest associates? Was it their concern that he was perhaps associating with some former members of the Communist Party? I think not. I think it was clear that King was a great patriot, even to the members of the FBI, even to the leaders of the FBI. I think what J. Edgar Hoover and others sensed was that King posed a threat to the status quo, that he might demand a change in the power structure in American society, and that if he could build a coalition, build the support of black and white Americans, that the people who had been hoarding power for centuries might be forced to give some of it up. And that truly scared J. Edgar Hoover. So what we see over the next years, the remaining 5 years of King's life, is that he's living under constant threat, constant surveillance. He knows the FBI is following. He knows that he's not perfect. He knows that he's been having relationships with women other than his wife, and that the FBI is weaponizing that behavior in an attempt to destroy him. Now, by this time, he's been stabbed in the chest, his home has been bombed, his home has been shot at, he's getting death threats almost weekly, and he knows that every day could be the day he wakes up and reads in the paper what the FBI has been leaking to the mainstream media about his personal life. He's operating under those pressures every day. And yet, he might have been tempted to step back. He might have been tempted to say, I'm taking some time off. He might have been justified in saying he's going to let someone else lead for a while. He does not do that. In fact, he doubles down over and over, becoming more radical, calling out northern racism, saying it's not enough for you to give money to the SCLC and to other organizations to fight racism, to fight segregation, to expand voting rights. It's not enough when the racism in the North is just as bad, just better camouflaged. And he moves to Chicago, my hometown, moves into a segregated, poverty-stricken neighborhood to call attention to what's going on there. And he begins speaking out on other issues. He begins speaking out on poverty, on war. He becomes one of the fiercest opponents of the Vietnam War. And all of this just brings more scrutiny, more pressure down upon him. And in fact, some of his closest advisors, some of the people who were more radical than him when he began his career, are saying, you know, you're hurting your own cause, Dr. King. You should stick to what you're good at. You should stay in the South. You should work on voting rights. If we just focus there, we have the most effect. But King refused to do that because his beliefs were not rooted in politics. His beliefs were rooted in the Bible. His beliefs were rooted by the philosophy that he studied here and so many other places. And he said he would be untrue to his core beliefs if he did the pragmatic thing. There's this unbelievably tragic, sad phone call, and we have the transcript of it. Thank you, FBI. After King gave what I consider his greatest speech, the Beyond Vietnam speech at a Riverside Church in New York on April 4th, 1967, exactly 1 year before his death, he said that America may be the greatest purveyor of violence on earth. And after that speech, one of his closest friends called him and said, I didn't like that speech. It didn't sound like you, and it's going to hurt our cause. And we have the transcript, so we know exactly what King said afterwards. He said, don't you know me? Don't you know who I am? Don't you know what I've been fighting for all of these years? It may have been politically unwise, but it was not morally unwise. And King continues to double down, despite the fact that his closest friends and allies are telling him to tone it down, to stay in your lane. And he begins planning his greatest, most ambitious, most radical campaign of all, the Poor People's Campaign. It's basically Occupy Washington, D.C. He's going to bring thousands of people to the mall in Washington, D.C., and they're going to stay there until the government agrees to fundamental reforms in the economy, in voting rights, in an end to the Vietnam War. And it's not going well. King's popularity has fallen off the cliff. Americans are losing interest in him. He feels like no one's listening to him anymore, and it's tearing him up inside. And yet he continues to plan for this march, for this occupation of Washington. And while he's planning this, and he's having a hard time recruiting, one of his closest friends, Reverend James Lawson, asked him to come to Memphis to help support the sanitation workers who are on strike there. And once again, King's friends and advisors say, you can't go to Memphis. You're working on this big plan and it's not going well. You need to stay focused. But King cannot say no because the workers, the poor men manning those garbage trucks, need his support, and he goes to Memphis. The first march ends in violence. Now he's more determined than ever to see this thing through. And we all know about his last speech the night before his assassination. The night before, April 3rd, 1968, he speaks and says, he has seen the promised land. He has been in the mountaintop. He may not get there with us, but he knows that together as a people we will get there. He's still full of hope. He is not giving up, despite the tremendous pressure, despite the failures, despite the fact that he feels like sometimes his dream has turned into a nightmare. And he perseveres. He's ready to march again. And the next day, as he's preparing for the march, he's on the balcony at the Lorraine Motel, and his friends are down in the parking lot. They're getting ready to go to dinner. They're talking about what they're going to eat that night for dinner. They're laughing. And King's driver says to him, you know, Doc, it's getting chilly. I think you should go back in and get a jacket. And King says, "Okay, I will." And he turns. And those were his last words. "Okay, I will." I wrote this book because I wanted us to remember King's true courage. I wrote this book because there are so many parallels, frustrating, at times hopeless parallels between racial conditions in the 1950s and 60s and today. And I wrote this book because America listened once to King's words and reacted to them. And I believe that if we listen to King's words again, his real words, that we might once again react. And that Dr. King can once again give all of us the power to not lose hope, to adapt to change, to adapt to what's going on around us, and to say, all of us, "Okay, I will." Thank you. And we have some time for questions. There's microphones down here, if you wouldn't mind coming down and using the microphones. I know you guys have to move on to class soon, but happy to take any questions we have time for.
No?
I can hear you, but here, do you want to use this?
It's working now? Good afternoon. My name is Dylan Legend. I'm a freshman political science major from Atlanta, Georgia, and I want to start off by saying thank you for coming out to speak to us today. It was definitely an inspiration to hear much more personal details about King's life than what is revealed to us through the media and other public knowledge. My question for you is, at the time of Martin's death and as well as Malcolm X's death, it caused such an outrage that kind of changed the status quo and almost destroyed the Black community. Why do you think that is?
Well, why did their deaths? One of the really interesting things about political assassinations is that we never know the impact they have. It's immeasurable. But I think that, as I mentioned earlier, some people who are interested only in retaining power see radicals as a threat to their power. And I think it's clear that while we don't know who ordered the assassination of Malcolm X, and we don't know whether there was any conspiracy involved in the assassination of Martin Luther King, we do know that the establishment had an interest in seeing radicals go away. And one of the things we know about Dr. King's assassination is that just months prior to the assassination, the FBI issued a memo, sent it to every FBI office, saying that King must not be allowed to become America's Black Messiah. And that's well documented. You can see the memo online. It's not a fictional. It's not a fiction of our. It's not fictional. It's true. And I think that what's interesting is that King and Malcolm X seem to be coming together philosophically in their later years, and the media and the government had an interest in making sure that didn't happen, I'm afraid.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Greetings. Pleasure to make your acquaintance. My name is Deshaun Brooks. I'm a freshman pre-C2 major from Washington, D.C. First off, thank you for coming and presenting this to us. This is a really amazing book. I just started reading it. It's
Thank you.
pretty good to read from what I've already read. What do you believe was the most challenging part? I know like Martin Luther King's life was like pretty complex, to say the least. And there was a lot of facets that you probably had to like reach into when you were trying to like build the book, build it in general, this world that he was in. What do you believe was the most like difficult thing about like creating this?
Ah, man, great question. For me, I think the most challenging part of this book was that I had to learn so much from scratch. As students of Morehouse, you have a base of knowledge that I lacked. I'm also Jewish, so the theology that I had to learn was a steep climb for me. I was very fortunate to really have a team of supporters, including some people here at Morehouse. But very early on, I said, I'm aware of what I don't know. I'm aware of what my own background has kept me from learning, and I need to catch up quickly. So I quickly reached out to a number of scholars, as well as people who knew King, and just asked them for help. For example, when it came to King's theology, there's a great professor named Lewis Baldwin who was a huge help to me and would read chapters for me as I was writing them. So I think I had so much ignorance to overcome, but I give myself a little credit for at least asking for help and trying to get others to work with me to overcome some of my own deficits. There's just also a tremendous amount of material to master in any biography, but especially in a biography of someone whose life has been as well documented as King, just to get through understanding all of his education, understanding the FBI's documents that they compiled against him, understanding his sermons, understanding the impact that he had on others in the civil rights movement. There was just a lot to learn. So that's why it took me 6 years, and I probably could have taken another 6 and still kept learning. Thank you.
Hello. Oh, excuse me. Yeah, my name is Leonard McReynolds. I'm a senior accounting major from Atlanta, Georgia. I wanted to thank you for coming and addressing us, this morning. I have a kind of a two-part question. One, what purpose do you think, the watering down of King's politics served, and do you think it kind of served a purpose of maybe neutralizing black politics today in terms of his legacy? And then two, with regards to kind of a modern movement to address black issues, maybe like reparations or something. What are the arguments, in your opinion, for, I know there's a lot of talk about, some people say, oh, well, reparations, we should have done it when slavery ended, but, no one here alive today was owner of, enslaved people, or maybe it's, the statute of limitations, to address an injustice like that is too long. What do you think about that? So, yeah.
First of all, when it comes to watering down King, many people I interviewed, including John Lewis and Harry Belafonte and Andrew Young, said, of course, they supported the creation of the national holiday, but it had the unintended consequence of denying us one of our radical heroes, that the government's ownership of him, so to speak, turned him into a safer figure than he really was, and as a result of that, the teaching, the curriculums that are designed, even the books that are offered for sale at the National Monument, deny him his true power, because we offer this softened version of King, this candy-coated version of King, and I hope this book and others after it will help to correct that. And as for the second half of your question, which I'm now blanking on, sorry.
Yeah, just in terms of reparations.
Reparations. King said it best, and I'm not going to try to add on that. King said that it's not about whether it can be done or how much, it's about the moral issue. That until morally we atone for our sins, the sins continue to bleed. And I think that's exactly right. And he also made the point more practically that we come up with dollar amounts all the time in court cases around injury. Doesn't have to be the perfect amount. There's no way to estimate how much your mother's life is worth when you're suing for her wrongful death. But you have to pay something to show the spirit of your atonement before you can move on. I think that is fair.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm going to ask the three gentlemen who are standing to ask your question, one right after another, very succinctly, briefly, and he'll give an answer to all of them.
How you doing? Do you think violent retaliation has no place in the civil rights movement? Did you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
I just wanted to ask, what do you have to say about politicians who use Martin Luther King's name while at the same time working to diminish the black vote and black success?
You're gonna make me remember.
Hello. Some people argue that America is no less racist than it was back during when King was fighting, and others argue otherwise. My question is, what do you believe King would say about that issue?
Okay. I would say Dr. King certainly believed that there was no use for violence in the civil rights movement ever. And I'm not going to speak. I'll let Dr. King rule on that. Obviously, he faced criticism for that. I think it's heinous that politicians routinely use King's words to endorse policies that he would absolutely object to, beginning with affirmative action. Every time you hear a politician say Dr. King would be opposed to affirmative action because he said we should be judged by the content of our character, we need to call them out because that's a lie. Dr. King's words are twisted beyond recognition, and we need to defend his words and say to people, read his words. Don't try to bend them for your own personal uses. And as far as whether we are better off today in terms of race than we were in King's time, I think that's a better question for your teachers, for your professor, for Dean Carter. But I believe King would say, and did say, that we were making progress, but we still had a long way to go.
Thank you very much. Thank you so very much. Your instructions, listen very carefully. All the young men with copies of the biography, please rise. That includes you. Come to the platform very quickly. The audience, please rise and stay in place. Move, please. Okay. Just go right across. Now remember the announcements that I made earlier. First come, first serve, 5:30. You will have a chance to receive a copy of this bound to be a bestseller, definitive biography. We're now going to sing the college hymn. If the audience is too large at 5:30, we will come to the nave. Otherwise, we're in the African American Hall of Fame, and there will be a second handout that I will not call by name now.
Gentlemen, please join hands, sing the college hymn. You'll have the QR code as soon as you're finished.